My name is Mia, and I'm a funeral director. I know what most people are probably thinking when they hear that, and I know why I'm standing here telling you this story. No, my funeral home is not haunted, at least not in the way people imagine. I work at a beautiful, family-owned one that takes enormous pride in dignity, compassion, and professionalism. I truly love my job. I'm honored to care for those who have passed and to guide their families through moments most people never imagine having to face. For anyone who has ever considered this line of work, it is emotionally demanding, physically exhausting, and often misunderstood. But to me, it is deeply meaningful. Every day reminds me how important it is to treat the dead with the same respect we give the living. To go back to the beginning, I've always been sensitive, interested in things beyond what we can see or explain. That curiosity didn't lead me into this profession. Death itself has never frightened me. I've always believed that death is not an end, but a transition. I grew up in a house where strange things happened and have many stories from my childhood, but those are from another time. This story begins with a call I received one ordinary day. It was from a young man called Gerald. Gerald had sustained what was documented as an accidental gunshot wound, entering beneath the chin and exiting through the forehead. I say accidental because the family simply would not accept any other explanation, and in truth neither could I. Gerald was a very young veteran who had served in the army and was struggling deeply with civilian life after his return, as so many who serve our country do. He carried many lasting wounds. Death is my everyday reality. I do not panic when the phone rings, and I went to pick up Gerald from the medical examiner. At that point, I didn't know how he had died, and that's normal. Funeral directors do not know until the doctor sign for the cause of death. Medical examiners and coroners are responsible for determining cause and manner of death in cases involving homicide, suicide, or unknown circumstances or unidentified individuals. Gerald's family chose direct cremation, but they wanted to see him one last time. That meant he needed to be prepared for a brief identification viewing without embalming. I knew going in that it would be detailed and delicate work, and that's when everything changed. I brought Gerald into our prep room and placed him gently on the table. The room was quiet except for the hum of the ventilation system and the familiar clinical smells that have long since become normal to me. When I unzipped the body bag, I realized that the preparation would be far more extensive than I had anticipated. The wound was severe. There was significant trauma, and he had also undergone a cranial autopsy, which meant reconstruction and careful suturing would be required. Whenever I'm preparing someone, I play music. It helps me stay calm and focused. It keeps my emotions steady and reminds me that I'm still human. That day I had the Wicked Broadway soundtrack playing through Spotify. As I began working, the music stopped without warning. It switched to a rap song which I had never heard before. I don't listen to rap. Ever. My playlists are full of rock, alternative, and musicals. Yeah, I'm aware that makes me a nerd. I froze where I stood. Every hair on my body stood up, and I felt chills rush from the back of my neck to my spine. I stood there trying to make sense of it. Maybe my watch changed the song. Maybe I accidentally touched my phone. But I was in the middle of a soundtrack playlist, and this song wasn't familiar at all, and I listened more closely as it reached the chorus. I have no more pain, I have no more pain. And the chills intensified. The air in the room felt charged. My hands started shaking as I pulled my mask down to breathe. I felt watched. And then suddenly, as the fear hit me, it vanished. What replaced it was warm, calm peace, like a reassurance, like someone saying, "It's okay. I'm okay." I stepped out of the prep room, heart racing, trying to ground myself. I took a few deep breaths and reminded myself where I was and went back in. I put my mask on and spoke out loud. I told him he could play whatever music he wanted, and apologized for making him listen to Wicked. The next song that played was by Gorillaz, the one that starts with a laugh. I actually laughed out loud in response and the tension broke. I continued my work, talking to him as though he was still there. I told him his family would be coming tomorrow and that I would take care of him, that he was safe. Normally I would never share experiences like this with families, but I felt strongly that it wasn't about me. It was about him needing to be heard. For the next 2 hours, song after song played that I'd never heard before, music I would have never chosen. I felt as though he was sharing pieces of himself with me. The room no longer felt empty, and at the end of the day, I finished my work and said goodbye. I turned to leave the room and felt a distinct tug on the back of my gown, but of course there was nothing behind me that could have caught the fabric. I told him again that his family would see him tomorrow, and that after that, he would need to move on. After that day, I never experienced anything unusual in the funeral home again. No strange sounds or feelings of presence, no one changing my music. I believe, wholeheartedly, that he needed someone to listen before he could let go. I did tell his family what happened. Until that moment, they had been completely consumed by denial. I hadn't seen them cry, not even during the viewing. When I mentioned their music, they stopped me and said it was his favorite artist. They broke down. We cried together, hugged for a long time, and I gave them the space to grieve in a way they hadn't been able to before. And it remains one of the most profound moments of my career. I'm grateful that I was chosen to care for Gerald, not just in death, but whatever comes after. Thank you for listening to my story, and to his. And please remember, suicide is not the answer. There are people who care for you. You matter. I was a funeral director between 2015 and 2021, and when I first joined, I was told that the branch was haunted. I'm a believer, but won't accept something as paranormal until I've run out of logical explanation. I saw and heard a lot of things there, but the two that stick out with me happened within a month of each other. One evening, I was the only living person in the funeral home. I was sat at the front desk, inputting a first call, which is the initial contact we have to let us know a family is thinking of using us for their loved one, onto our system. I began to hear knocking coming from behind me. Now bear in mind, my branch has commercial shops on either side, so this was different than the usual hustle and bustle of sounds. It was very clear and distinctive knocking coming from our in-house mortuary. I got up to check if some funeral service crew had let themselves in through the back to perhaps bring a new deceased person to rest with us. No, the back door was closed and no one was in there. While I was in the mortuary, I couldn't hear any knocking, so I decided to make sure no one was playing tricks on me. I deadbolted the back door and set the alarm system for the mortuary. Going back out to my front desk, the second my butt touched the chair, bang, bang, bang. At this point it's around 4:40 p.m. and I just want to go home. I stand up and go to the door of the mortuary and ask if anyone is there. Nothing. Then I start to hear the sound of someone walking around on the tiled floor, but the alarm doesn't trip. I put my ear to the door to get a better idea of what I'm hearing, and I feel a physical bang against the wood. It made me jump, and was the first time I've had a genuine hair-raising on the back of my neck experience. The rest of my shift was spent firmly planted at my desk, ignoring the various knocks and bangs from the back. A few weeks later, I was filing some archived funeral arrangements in the storeroom just next to the mortuary. That room was apparently known for being haunted by an apparition known as Head and Shoulders. Quite literally. It was said to appear as the top half of a man's body that was seen moving around in that room and the adjoining hallway that led to the staff bathrooms. Needless to say, there's a certain level of vulnerability in going to the toilet with a spirit wandering nearby, so many of our staff refused to go in there. I've never seen this spirit, and believe me, I've looked. Now on this occasion, I wasn't looking for Head and Shoulders. I was just filing paperwork, mumbling to myself about having some annual leave denied. I heard the bathroom door open and close. This is one of those old doors that is weighted to swing closed by itself, which means basically the door won't open on its own. I paused and listened, but couldn't hear anything else, so I decided to have a peek through the window in the door leading to the bathroom, and in the unlit corridor, I thought I could make out a person on the other end. Perhaps a funeral service crew member had nipped in before and I hadn't noticed. But the person wasn't moving at all. So I made the very gullible decision to lean into the window and cup my hand around my face to get the best view without entering the corridor. Now I could see the entire corridor and realized this person is a shadow on the top half of a torso and a head. I am completely convinced that not only is the spirit intelligent, but has a wicked sense of humor, because not more than 2 seconds after I came to my realization of what I was seeing, does it launch itself towards the door window. I got such a fright from this thing being at the far end of the hallway 1 second, to all but body slamming the door, I ended up on my backside shouting more than a few profanities. My colleague came through to see what I was shouting about, and when I told him, his response was, "Oh, you finally saw him then." I live in an apartment in Pennsylvania. The building is over 100 years old and is right next to a funeral home. I've been here and never had any really strange experiences up until the last couple of weeks. I should also note that I have a child that lives with me half the time, and the other half she's with her mum. One night while I was drifting off to sleep, I started to feel the onset of sleep paralysis. All my limbs were going stiff, and I started to feel pinned down. Luckily, I was able to snap myself out of it by reaching for the closest thing to the ground, which was my phone. I was able to sleep fine after that. Then maybe a week later, my daughter is asleep in her room, which connects to my bedroom through a doorway that sits directly across from my bed. I woke up and saw the silhouette of a child standing against the wall next to the doorframe for my daughter's room. It was just this black mass darker than the room itself, with no face or distinguishable limbs or hair, and just stood there like it was staring at me. Her door was still closed, and the figure was on the side that would be covered by the door if I were to open it. I was definitely freaked out but chose to ignore it, turning my gaze away from it and went back to sleep. When I woke up again a few hours later, it was gone like nothing had ever happened. Fast forward a few days and my girlfriend and I are at a flea market and run into a medium selling her wares and talking to people. I told her what I was experiencing, and she looked concerned and told me to cleanse my apartment by burning sage. She also gave me a small vial of holy oil to put on my front entrance to keep bad spirits away. She also wanted me to put some on my daughter's forehead to protect her. The next day, my girlfriend and I went to my apartment to do the cleanse. While I was cleaning a room, my girlfriend was waiting in the kitchen, which has my front door. My girlfriend and I suddenly both hear that door slam itself shut. She actually saw it happen, but after that my apartment has been more peaceful, and I no longer get a bad vibe. I do plan of leaving there though ASAP, for very different reasons all the same. Could it be that spirits from the funeral home chose to inhabit my apartment with me? Maybe. What do you all think? My uncle used to work at a small funeral home in our town. He wasn't the owner, just the guy who handled a bit of everything, be it prep work, paperwork, or late night calls. Well, one night he told me about something that stuck with him for years. Earlier that week, he had helped prepare someone he'd known personally. It was an old worker he'd been close to. He said it felt really strange working on someone whose voice he could still picture clearly in his mind. That night he was downstairs finishing up some reports. The building was completely empty. The lights were dimmed, and he went upstairs to grab something from the viewing room. And that's when he heard clear as day his co-worker's voice, coming from the hallway near the chapel. Calm, almost annoyed, like someone in the middle of a conversation. He said the words were something like, "No, I don't want to go yet." What unsettled him the most was the tone. There wasn't panic or fear. It sounded like someone politely arguing, like they were trying to convince someone standing right there with them. He checked every room, but there was nothing. He always insisted it didn't scare him at the moment, just confused him, but even now, years later, he refuses to stay alone in that building at night. He said a voice you know belongs to someone who shouldn't be able to speak anymore is a very different kind of fear. I have worked in the funeral business for almost 10 years. I'm an atheist, a skeptic, and in general deny the existence of the supernatural. However, there have been several instances of odd things that I have experienced in my time at one particular funeral home. Besides the general feeling of uneasiness, and like someone is watching you, and always having the hair stand up on the back of your neck and hearing random footsteps upstairs when I'm alone in the building, there is one particular instance that I simply can't explain or write off as being something natural. One day, me and my co-workers are downstairs in the crematory office chatting. All of us. Our doors were locked because we weren't open at this time. We also have a door beep that beeps the alarms if someone opens any doors to the building. Well, while we were all sitting downstairs talking, we hear what sounds like someone moving around at the top of the stairs, which led up to the funeral director's office, and we hear a very distinct knocking, like the sound of someone knocking on a door to announce that they want to come in said door. We all heard this knocking sound at the door at the top of the stairs. It sounded not like something falling or water pipes or floor creaking, but legit like someone knocking intentionally by a human. The funeral directors ran upstairs thinking we had a customer and that we must have mistakenly left the door unlocked. My manager was like, why didn't the door beeper work? We must need to reset something. So my coworker goes to check on that to see why it isn't beeping to tell us when a customer's here. At the same time, the funeral director comes back down and says no one's there. The door is still locked, and my other coworker comes back to say the door beeper is working just fine. Also, another saw there were no cars in the parking lot besides our own. We all just kind of sat there dumbfounded, realizing that we all definitely witnessed distinct knocking at the funeral office door at the top of the stairs. This event was significant to me, due to the fact that there were multiple witnesses and we all assumed it was a customer knocking, and the fact that no one was actually there despite the knocking sounding so intentional and sounding exactly like it was at the funeral office door at the top of the stairs. The exact place a customer would knock if they were looking for us. To this day, I have no explanation. On a side note, many other strange things happened in this funeral home, such as doors slamming, footsteps, faint talking in the distance when no one else is here, and the feeling that someone is standing right behind you, which multiple people have independently experienced without talking to the other person about said things. These experiences are the closest thing to convincing me that the supernatural, or at least some sort of unexplainable phenomena involving the dead, is possibly real. My only thing is, if ghosts are real, why are they simply knocking on doors? I am a medical examiner who has many experiences with the paranormal. We do try our best to debunk situations before even sharing them with anyone. I've had a few experiences that were outside the morgue, and for this experience it was not my own, but a story of my colleague at the morgue. My colleague was called Anna, and was leaving the morgue 2 weekends ago after finishing up paperwork for me. I came in early so she could continue with her family things, and she offered to file paperwork, as I went out of my way to help her have a work-life balance. Anna is a loving mother of a 5-year-old boy called Tim. Tim loves Anna so much, always wanting to be around Mama. Well, that night she came home and got in the shower and got ready for bed, went to kiss Tim goodnight, but his door was open. His door is never open because he never figured out the child guard. He was sound asleep in his little car bed, perfectly still and peaceful. The door was the only thing that was off. Anna brushed it off, gave him a kiss goodnight and shut the door and went to the bedroom. She asked her husband about it, but he said he had shut the door. She figured he managed to crawl out of bed and get it open somehow and went back to sleep, and did not check the cameras at that point. All is good. They had an explanation that made sense and went to bed around 1:30 a.m. At around 3 a.m, Tim runs into their bedroom crying and yelling, terrified. Anna and her husband have no idea what's happening. They don't know how he got out of his room. They looked at the baby cam, and he was asleep, as the door opened this time. Seen by the hallway light, as the camera doesn't face the door, plus no shadow that should be there. It woke him up. He turned and said something, but Anna said that it didn't come through the audio, nor could she read lips, as it wasn't that great of a camera. It was an old one that they had from another family member when the other one stopped working the week prior. It is set up because her son has a health condition, so they have it only facing the bed. All Tim and Anna can tell is there was a big man with a hat and glowing eyes who said to go away. Since then, there have been a few instances of things out of place or random doors open, but Tim never saw the man again. He will randomly say things to his friend who was a little girl, but we haven't really noticed anything paranormal about that, so we think that it might be his imagination. I know he has a vivid imagination, but in this case, it wasn't sunshine and Legos. It was a dark, big man. We don't think this is just his imagination, but I would like your opinion. And also, he doesn't have access to any videos or the internet. So, make of it what you will. I was alone. My colleague was out on a call and it was late. I was cleaning up the morgue and just getting some paperwork done. There was a knock on the door that led to the area people were waiting to speak to us in. It was odd, we never locked the door, at least not from what I had been told. It is full access because the morgue itself is blocked off. They have the ability to walk around instead of feeling so cramped. I ignore it and continue what I'm doing. It happens again. This time it was quieter. I ignore it again, but told myself if it happened again that I would go to check. Not many people come by after midnight and no one in the area is waiting to speak to me. Well, as you can probably guess, it happened again. At this point I'm just annoyed and want to get my things done to go home. I walk over to the area from the hallway, and I swear there's a little boy sitting there. I of course freak out and rush in to see if he's lost or needs help, as he was in the seat furthest from the door when I saw him. I rush in and see nothing, absolutely nothing, no kid at all. In my job we don't always know the identity of our patients right away, so hypothesizing on an age is something we often do. I'd say he looked about 7, too big to duck out of sight in this room. I was beyond confused and asked my colleague about it since she knows about these experiences and I share a lot of my own with her. Anyway, she told me there has been a boy in that room for over a year. He isn't with us, he died in a car crash last year and didn't make it. She's been able to make contact once and said he spoke about his family and waiting for them to come join him. I can't stop thinking about it, that encounter, and I don't know how to help him, or if he even wants it. This story was told to me by a mortician friend of mine, someone who has spent years around death. He approached everything with a clinical mindset, and admitted there was one night he couldn't explain. It happened after a violent clash in Mexico between cartel members and federal police. By the time it was over, there were around 11 dead, both officers and sicarios, their bodies torn apart. Not long after, a message came through from the cartel. They wanted the bodies returned or there would be consequences, and no one took the request lightly. Because of the tensions, the bodies were transferred to a small local mortuary run by this man, someone trusted enough to handle them discreetly and quickly. He was told the situation was volatile and that he needed to work fast, and that the federal officer would remain stationed outside to guard the building through the night. It wasn't unusual in cases like this, just another layer of precaution in case things spiraled quickly. The day stretched on longer than expected, turning into night before he'd even realized how exhausted he was. The bodies kept coming, the space inside the cooler quickly became an issue, and at one point he stepped back into the hallway and noticed the officers standing just outside the double doors that led into the overflow room where some of the bodies had been placed temporarily. The doors had narrow rectangular windows, and he could see the silhouettes through the glass. And from where the officer stood, he wouldn't have had any view of the outside entrance or the surrounding property. That struck him as odd. If the man was supposed to be guarding the building, why position himself somewhere with no line of sight? Why stand there completely still facing inward, as if he were watching the dead instead of protecting the living? The mortician paused for a moment, studying the figure through the glass. The officer didn't move. Eventually he shrugged it off. It had been a long day, and exhaustion does strange things to your perception. After some effort, he managed to reorganize the cooler, making just enough room to fit the remaining bodies inside, although it was tight. And when he finally stepped back into the hallway and opened the door to speak to the officer, the space outside was empty. There hadn't been any footsteps or sound of movement, no indication that anyone had just walked away. 1 second the man had been there, clearly visible through the window, and the next, he was gone. The mortician stood there for a moment, staring into the empty hallway, trying to make sense of it, before eventually convincing himself it was nothing more than fatigue playing tricks on him. He finished what he needed to do, locked up, and stepped outside, ready to go home. That's when he saw the patrol car. It was parked right where it had been all day, near the front of the building, and inside sat the officer, exactly where he was supposed to be. The mortician walked over and asked why he'd suddenly left his post inside. "Sir, I've been out here all day. Was there someone else inside with you?" The two of them then rushed inside the building together, moving quickly through the halls towards the room with the double doors. The hallway was empty. There were no signs of forced entry, no doors open, and nothing had been disturbed. They moved to the cooler. The mortician pulled out a heavy door and both men froze. Inside, among the bodies that had been carefully arranged minutes earlier, something had changed. Standing upright in the confined space, impossible as it was the upper half of one of the dead officers. From the waist up, his torso held rigid in a perfect military stance. The squad commander, the man who led the others, who had died in the firefight, stood there positioned as if guarding the rest of the bodies. Neither of them moved. And then slowly, so slow it almost didn't feel real, the figure began to fade. After that night, the mortician never claimed to understand what he had seen, but never denied it. I used to work as a paramedic, and over the years saw more than my fair share of death, be it car wrecks, overdoses, or medical calls that never ended well. You learn to process things quickly, because that's the only way to do the job. But there's one call I responded to that really messed with me. So we were dispatched alongside police and fire for a report of a man who had drowned near a set of railroad tracks in a deeply wooded area, roughly 500 yards from the nearest access road. A railroad employee doing a routine safety check had spotted the body down an embankment and called it in. By the time we arrived, it was already getting dark. We parked as close as we could and hauled our gear the rest of the way on foot. The man was lying still at the base of the embankment, partially obscured by the terrain, and right away it was clear this wasn't going to be a rescue. No pulse or breathing, EKG confirmed flatline. He was gone. There were no visible injuries, trauma or blood, no sign of a struggle or accident. His body wasn't cold yet and rigor hadn't set in, which meant he hadn't been there long. We checked for needle marks thinking OD but found nothing. We palpitated for fractures, nothing. The railroad worker told us no train had come through that stretch in at least 8 hours, so that ruled out the most obvious explanation. It didn't add up. We expanded our search of the area and found a small makeshift campsite tucked deeper into the woods, a crude shelter that suggested the man might have been living there, But even there we found nothing that explained his demise. No medication or drugs, nothing unusual. Just the bare essentials of a guy trying to get by. Not far from where we were, there was an area locals liked to talk about, a place that had rumored to be haunted. We were still waiting on the funeral home to arrive and transport the body, standing around in the dark with nothing but our flashlights. And that's when we started to feel strange. A few of us heard what sounded like whispering, low, indistinct voices that didn't seem to come from any one direction. It wasn't like someone was nearby talking, it was more like the sound was everywhere at once. Some of the guys didn't hear it at all, and immediately assumed we were messing with them, trying to get a rise out of them in the middle of the night. Then just as suddenly as it started, it stopped, and that's when it flipped. The people who hadn't heard the whispering before suddenly started reacting, looking around and asking if we could hear that. What they described was children laughing. They said it sounded twisted, like something playful, pretending to be human but not quite. And just like the whispering, it didn't come from any specific location but from all around us. What made it worse was those of us who had heard the whispering didn't hear the laughter at all. It was like whatever was out there had split us into two groups, each hearing something the other could not. This went on for 10, maybe 15 minutes, with all of us standing there next to the body trying to stay grounded, trying to explain it away, but no one could. Eventually, the officers called it in over the radio, telling dispatch to have the funeral home hurry up. When they arrived, no one wasted any time. We helped load the body onto the stretcher, if you could even call it that. There was no careful handling, no attention to detail like there usually is. We just wanted out of there. We didn't even bother strapping him in properly. At that point, the logic was simple. He was already dead, and getting away from that place mattered more than the procedure. And we cleared the scene as fast as we could. The next day, my partner and I went to the morgue to follow up with the coroner, hoping for some kind of explanation that would make everything from the night before feel a little more grounded in reality. But it only got worse. The first thing the coroner asked us is why we had cleaned the body before transport. We told him we hadn't done anything like that, and that there hadn't been any blood at the scene to clean him in the first place. He looked at us and said it didn't make sense, because during the autopsy he found that the body contained no blood whatsoever. There were no wounds or puncture marks, nothing to suggest where it could have gone or how it had been removed, as if it had just vanished. He admitted that it was complicated, and he couldn't determine a clear cause of death. Then almost as an afterthought, he mentioned that something strange had happened while he was performing the autopsy, but when we pressed on him for what it was, he refused to elaborate. We never got answers. Out of all the calls I've ever been on, that one still sticks with me. For the past 4 years, I've worked as a funeral director and embalmer, splitting my time between two separate locations, which I won't name for obvious reasons. Before I get into what happened, it's important to understand something about this line of work. Most people find it unsettling just to think about, but for those of us in it, you get used to things pretty quickly. As an embalmer, I've seen and done things that would turn most stomachs inside out. After a while, though, the sights and smells and atmosphere don't get to you anymore. You kind of build an emotional and physiological tolerance, which is why the things I'm about to describe never sat right with me. So, in location 1, the first major experience happened during a night that on the surface was completely ordinary. It was 2 a.m. when I returned from a hospital death call, pulling into the lot of the funeral home that had been standing for over 130 years. When you're working, your attention narrows. You don't think much about beyond what you're doing, but in the middle of the process, I became aware of something off. It started as a subtle chill. Not so much the temperature of the room, but just this overwhelming feeling. I paused for a moment, glancing around, then brushed it off and resumed my work. After I finished, I stepped into the casket showroom next door and flipped on the light. The room lit up fully. Every corner was visible, and that is when I saw it. In the far corner, there was something like a black mist hanging in the air. Not a shadow or a trick of the light, something with a shape. And I stared at it, trying to process what it was. and then it slowly disappeared into that corner. I stood there longer than I cared to admit, completely still trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. But I knew for a fact I had been alone in that building, and whatever had been there had been watching me the entire time. The second incident happened weeks later at the end of a long day. It was close to 11 p.m, and like always, I went to my room, turning the lights off before leaving. Once I was done, I got into my car and happened to glance up at one of the second floor windows, and a lamp was on. At first, it annoyed me more than anything. I figured I had missed it during my walkthrough, but I was exhausted and didn't feel like going back in just for that, and decided I'd deal with it in the morning. But something about it stuck with me. The light didn't look like it was coming from the corner where the lamp usually sat. It seemed to be glowing from the middle of the room. That room belonged to the location manager, and the lamp itself had some history. It had originally belonged to his wife, who had passed away and had her services held in that very building. He brought it from home afterwards and kept it on his desk. That next morning I made a point to go upstairs first thing and turn it off. And when I stepped into the office I stopped dead, because the lamp was sitting in the center of his desk unplugged. There was no one else there. I was the first employee to arrive, and I had been the last one to leave that night. No one had access to the building overnight. There was no explanation for how the light had been on. And those were just the moments I couldn't ignore. Let me tell you about location 2. For a period of about 6 to 8 months, I actually lived in an apartment above the second funeral home. It was fully furnished, free room and board, and made life incredibly convenient, and at the time felt like a lucky break, but it didn't stay that way. The first incident happened just a few weeks after I moved in. It was around 1 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the stairs leading up to the apartment. I immediately knew something was wrong. If there had been a death call, I would have been notified. There was no reason for anyone to be in the building, especially not at that hour, and I lay there completely still listening. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and stopped outside my bedroom door. Then came 2 knocks. I didn't respond, I just stared at the door. After a few seconds, the footsteps started again, this time moving away, going back down the stairs until everything was quiet. And I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Whatever had been there knew I was inside that room. The second experience was just as unsettling. One evening I was in the kitchen eating alone as usual, when I looked up and saw the doorknob across the room slowly turn. The door opened as if someone had just walked through it, and then closed again. But there was no one there. No draft or airflow or anything to have caused it. And I just sat there staring at the door, trying to process what I had just witnessed, knowing there was no reasonable explanation. But the most recent experience was the one that affected me the most, and it happened during the middle of the day. I was downstairs in the main part of the funeral home, sitting on a couch during a break. On weekends, if there are no services or arrangements, we keep the building locked and the lights off. I was completely alone. I stood up and walked into the main hallway when I saw a man standing in the doorway to the chapel. He was clear as day, solid, not like a shadow or flicker of movement, wearing a navy blue pinstripe suit and a white collar shirt. His hair was grey, slicked back, and he stood about my height, maybe a little hunched over, and for reference I'm 6'2". Without thinking, I called out to him, "Hey you!" But he didn't reply or acknowledge me. He simply turned and walked into the chapel. I immediately followed, rounding the corner he had just disappeared behind. And there was nothing there. No one, the room was empty. That's when the reality of what I had just seen hit me at once, and I felt something close to panic. I called the location manager, the same one from the other building, and described the man in detail. There was a brief pause on the line, and he told me that it sounded exactly like the former manager of that location, a man who had once lived in the very same apartment I had been staying in years before. In that moment, everything clicked into place, and none of it felt random anymore. Anyway, those are my stories. I spoke once to a man who worked as a night warden in a hospital mortuary. He told me he does not like staying in the mortuary at night without drinking alcohol first. He said the place feels very strange for him. According to him, When he stays there at night without alcohol, he hears unknown sounds like slow footsteps and quiet voices. Many times he feels that someone is nearby, even though the room is empty. He also told me that he has seen human-like figures inside the mortuary, not clearly, but enough to know that they were not shadows or reflections. He said this happened more than once and always at night. He spoke in a very normal way, like this was just part of his job. He didn't try to scare or exaggerate anything, but that, if anything, made me feel like he was telling the truth. My ex worked at a funeral home for many years in San Rafael, California. Creepy things happened from time to time, but nothing truly terrifying. Well, one day he was in the chapel helping to bring in the deceased for their service, when this heavy brass bald eagle statue that must have weighed at least 20 pounds shot off the mantle and flew 4 feet across the room and straight at my ex-boyfriend's head. He jerked back just in time but quit that day and never went back to the funeral industry and ended up working in a coffee shop for half the pay instead. I never experienced anything the few times I visited his place of work, but he and his best friend who also worked there used to talk about seeing an old man in a brown suit out of the corner of their eye all the time. He was apparently one of the former funeral directors, maybe checking in to make sure things were still running smoothly at his old workplace. 3 or 4 years ago, I travelled to Himachal Pradesh from Delhi with my uncle's family. Instead of staying in hotels, we stayed at his relative's house along the way. One particular night stands out in my memory. We were travelling back from Hamipur to another small town late at night. It must have been around 2 or 3 a.m. My uncle, who was familiar with the area, suddenly seemed unsure of our location after we passed what we thought was a scenic viewpoint, with a bus parked nearby. Our cell phone signals disappeared, leaving us in darkness with only the car's headlights. After driving in circles for what felt like a long time, we ended up back at the same viewpoint, with the bus not just once but 3 times. On the 4th pass, we noticed someone inside the bus. Thinking it was the bus driver, he sent my cousin to ask for directions. As we approached with our phone flashlight, we saw someone sitting in the middle of the bus, but when we entered, the bus was empty. Confused and uneasy, we hurried back to my uncle, who told us to climb up the viewpoint and check our location. To our shock, what we thought was a scenic viewpoint turned out to be a cremation ground. A body was still smouldering in the silence of the night. We ran back to the car, urging my uncle to drive away quickly. We reached our destination a few hours later and shared our strange experience with my uncle's distant aunt. She remained calm and explained that such things were not uncommon here, suggesting that someone was trying to prevent us from leaving, or perhaps simply wanted company that night. I couldn't sleep afterwards. The memory of that eerie encounter etched deeply in my mind. I've been working night shifts and part-time during the day as a human remains transporter. Last night, I had my second experience and thought I should share it. It was 2:30 a.m. and a call comes in for a body removal. It was a home removal which required 2 people. By the time my partner and I got to the body and made it to the funeral home, it was pushing 5 a.m. and the director told me to put the body in the prep room on the prep table, but it was already occupied. This led me to look around for another stretcher to put the body on. When I entered the adjacent room, there wasn't a stretcher, but I saw in the corner of my eye a completely black mass floating at the far end of the room. When I turned my head to get a better look, it was gone in an instant. I know I saw something. When I was hired, my boss did mention that ghosts and negative energy are a little bit of an occupational hazard, that and some communicable diseases. I took a class in college called Death and Dying. It was taught by an ex-coroner and overall was a really interesting course. One day we met at a local funeral home, and that was our classroom for the day. We took a tour of the place. They showed us all the back rooms, the sales floors with the coffins, and even showed us the incinerator round back. Nothing fazed me until we got to the embalming room. It was pearly white, everything was so bright and felt so lifeless and sterile. I stepped in with a friend of mine and almost immediately was overcome with this feeling that we should not be in there. It was a feeling in the pit of my gut that we needed to leave that place. I know it might sound corny or dramatic, but it was a very bizarre one. I'm usually not very squeamish or anything like that, and I don't remember being surprised by how strongly I felt about the room. I don't know what it was, but it was almost 10 years ago now, and I feel it like it was yesterday. I think there was some entity, something left over in that place that didn't want me in there. Perhaps I'm overthinking it, but I'd love to get your take on it. I worked this job for a few months, and one night I was working on Christmas Eve. I was pulling into one of the larger drop-off locations with several large garage doors and lanes for vehicles in the building. I drove to the far left one as it was, again, super late at night, and I was the only person there in the building. I park the van, get out, and go to open the back door to remove the body on the gurney, when I hear someone humming very faintly very far away. It was all echoey, and my blood felt like it was draining from my body. I listened to trying to get a sense from where the sound was coming from, but it stopped, so I was like, alright, that was weird. I unload the body and get inside and process the intake at the desk, finish up my paperwork and head back out to the van when I get into the garage, and there it is again, the humming. I actually did say out loud, "What is that?" But there was no answer and the humming kept going on. I stopped and listened again. I could get a sense of where it was coming from, so I started to walk in that direction. Turns out someone left a CD player running of someone singing carols. Almost needed a new pair of pants that night. I was more scared of the CD player than the guy in the science donation center. I do funeral pickup and drop-offs, and Buddhists have a belief that there's a prayer that is said over the deceased. I think it's called the Sukhavati or something like that. Well, some enterprising individual made a machine that says the prayer and travels with the deceased. I believe it's thought that the more it's said, the better chances someone has in the afterlife. So I pick up the deceased, and they have the machine playing during the ride, with the two of us in the van. I make sure it's secure, drop off the deceased at the intake facility, and in the morning I go pick them up and take them to the funeral. Now, as I'm sure you are aware what happens to batteries. When they get cold, they start not to work as well. And the deceased is kept in the freezer at these facilities. So all night the batteries in the machine were getting more and more run down, but it was still working. I open the freezer, and out comes this long, slow, deep, almost demonic sounding voice reciting the Buddhist prayer. The machine batteries were running so low due to the cold that it was causing the machine to not work properly. Another situation where I had to nearly change my pants. It was a beautiful service though. I stayed, as this is their tradition, and helped with transporting the deceased up the stairs, helping the family move them and during the service, and taking them back down the stairs and back to the van, all in the black suit without shoes. The Buddhists take a much more active role in caring for their deceased loved ones. It made me really start to think about the lesson we can learn from others. Overall, the whole job really reevaluated my life in numerous ways. And what do I want people to say about me when I die? What stories will they tell? Will people even show up? I don't know the answer to these questions and probably never will, but it really awoke something in me, and I live now a life of gratitude and love for myself as well as others. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I do hope you enjoyed tonight's stories, and of course are enjoying Paranormal Week. Speaking of paranormal, I'll be joining you again tomorrow for another collection of paranormal stories. And I'll see you on Saturday for Demons. I would like to extend one final huge thank you to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. Your contributions really do make a hell of a difference, so thank you all so much for what you do. Again, the cemetery stories, you can just listen to them for free. So, if you want that, you can just listen tomorrow for free. All right, I'm going to wrap things up here, guys. See you tomorrow. Stay awesome and good night.